neurology as being a very small field, but also certainly even with our adult neurology colleagues, incredible networking opportunities, and to this day, it's been many years now, those relationships remain relevant, a lot of those that I met. When you're early in your career, sometimes it can be difficult to start to network and to meet people outside of your own institution, whether that's in your own field or in a related field. And through a consortium, sometimes that can be a really nice platform for doing that. So now when I travel for grand rounds, or I'm looking for new collaborators, even some of the letters that I've received at times for promotion.
Oh, yeah.
And also, if you are asking a question, please ask. Otherwise, please mute. You know, all of those relationships, again, I've been able to call upon time after time over many years. This experience also led to multiple publications, both large group publications about baseline data or top-line results, as well as individual projects that I was able to lead through access to large-scale data or small kinds of pilots that I wanted to implement through the study. And these, again, experiences were foundational for being competitive for what was then an institutional NSADA K-12 award, and then later a multi-site FDA-funded R01 that I then led as well. So it was really incredibly formative in ways that I couldn't have predicted. So when we're talking about clinical research networks today, I think it's important to remember that that can take place in lots of different ways. It can range from more informal networks where you have a group of people with shared goals or shared ideas, and it's kind of a loose collaboration, to organizations that have much more intricate structure. And you're going to hear more about organizations like this, where you see that there's certainly a grouping of sites, and this is an organizational chart from the CARE Consortium. This is a public-private partnership focused on natural history and neurobiology of concussion. But you see you have sites here. Some of the sites may have some distinct and special capabilities. There's a coordinating center, an administrative core. There's what might be a steering committee, an executive committee of the funders, Department of Defense, NCAA, and NIH. Got an external advisory panel, and I imagine that this is just one fraction of the infrastructure that exists in this representation, but there really can be a wide range of complexity when we're talking about clinical research networks. And to a degree, it is important to understand which, of these kinds of entities are you actually dealing with, and thinking about what your opportunities might be, and also thinking in how you approach trying to become more involved. I think you can think about these research networks as integrated but distributed teams. You think about, in terms of scientific teams and scientific engagement, you have a lone investigator that all the work may happen within their own lab with an internal group of collaborators. And on the other end, you again have a much more diverse team, a larger team, and again, clear infrastructure and progress towards a goal, but through bringing together varied expertise. And that may take place in a single project or a number of parallel projects, but the roles and responsibilities are very, very clear. And again, can be really useful for fostering team science. So why might they be of interest to you? I think there are scientific components. Again, we understand more and more the advantages of team science, the power of diverse teams, and whether you're just starting out or whether you're well established with your work, often, especially for clinical research, you really do need collaborators and collaborators across sites. It makes the research feasible in some ways. So when you think about trying to stand up your own central coordination and data coordination for a large-scale study, or developing protocols and operating procedures anew, that's not efficient. And to be able to be a part of a network where the group has already decided and has really worked together to think about what are its goals, what are its operating principles, how do the institutions work together, you're not starting all of that from scratch. You're entering a network where there's some of those efficiencies already built in. You'll hear from Laurie Gutmann about how this has taken place through NeuroNEXT, and I think that's a really great example of efficiency. There's recruitment power, and there's Laurie right there. Thank you, Laurie, for joining. Recruitment power. If you're interested in conducting a study and you think your power needs to be 200 people enrolled and you have 50 at your site, you're either going to recruit for a really long time, or you're going to think about where you might be able to find collaborators to work together to bring that to fruition more efficiently. And there are other kinds of research feasibility goals and benefits of working within research teams. Access to resources, the specialized capability of either unique resources related to biological specimens, biomarker development, or central coordination, or biostatistics in certain kinds of analyses. There really may be specialized resources that you're able to access through a clinical research network, or specialized types of expertise that may exist in a network that are of interest to you and that you may contribute also. And certainly clinical research networks may have more power for partnership with patient organizations sometimes than the lone investigator as well. To really see a group of people working together towards common goals, to partner with those groups is of real interest to patient organizations. What about your career development? So in the example that I gave, it was really helpful in very quickly building clinical research experience on my end in learning not only operations, but then to be able to use existing data to answer questions that were of interest to me, and then also to be able to use that platform to develop and to develop a few pilot projects. Actually, one of those I even cited just the other day in a grant application where I was looking to do something new. Great writing opportunities, phenomenal networking and mentorship opportunities, and some clinical research networks actually have formalized training programs as well. So there are lots of career reasons why this can be beneficial. So how do you get involved? The first is to figure out what's relevant. And ideally, if you're thinking about this, thinking about pursuing a research career, you already have a research and career mentor who can help think about, well, what's right at this stage? What groups might be relevant for your disease population of interest, for your research topic, or for your field of research? And ideally, you have mutually relevant goals. You know what it is that you are looking to get out of working and collaborating within a network, and you also understand what the mission, what the directives and the goals of the research network are, and you're sure that those are aligned. And I think when there is that kind of alignment where there's something that you bring and something that's of value also to the network, and you see value in the network, there's much more likelihood of being able to move forward with your projects. And so understanding the network culture is something that's really key. And again, the network goals and priorities. Then there are logistics of getting involved. And some of that starts with understanding and knowing just, well, what's already at your center? And that can be as simple as asking around a little bit, or identifying networks of interest and then honing in on those within what's at your center. You can find out what has training opportunities or fellowship opportunities that exist. Some networks even have funding opportunities. Most don't, but some do have funding opportunities as well for people who are part or members of the network, as well as people who are outside. And you'll want to understand what those network processes look like. So I gave that example of research collaboration sometimes being a loose agreement between people, but sometimes it's much more formal. And there may be an application process and a vetting process to engaging with a network, whether that's about a specific study or whether it's truly becoming a member site, and understanding what those processes are key. Back to those mutually relevant goals, know what you bring, and also understand the funding structure as well. And so sometimes networks are well funded and are able to support their member sites, but sometimes that's not so clear. And so that's where coming back into thinking about what's involved with being a part of a network, what resources might that require, and what resources are available to you at your center. All of that is key in understanding what you can do. And then things are not all about funding and resources, but a little bit they are. And so you need to be able to support participation sometimes in these kinds of activities. And so for those of you who are underrepresented in medicine or science, I want to bring up diversity supplements. It's always important to remember these. So for Federally funded networks, it may be that that those are run under grant mechanisms that are relevant for NIH diversity supplements. So you may be able to fund the project or your effort or time for what you'd like to do within the network, at least on small scale, in part through diversity supplements. And there are certainly a number of people who have been able to do this. And if you'd like to talk more about that, I know of at least an example or two. And I have links to the program announcement, to the general information around diversity supplements here. And I'll pause to say that a recording of today's presentation and slides will be made available on the CNCDP website after today's presentation. So with all of those great things, I also want to highlight some areas for caution. And I think that timelines, agreements, and focus are really, really key. Ideally, things move from point A to point B in the exact way that you expect, in the timeline that you expect, but most of the time it doesn't work that way. And I think that's true for anything, whether you're talking about research in general or you're really talking about research collaborations. It may be that you think that you're at point A, and when really you're actually down here somewhere at a different starting place. You may think that you want to end up here, but actually you end up someplace that's a little bit different. And the course is likely to be meandering and to not quite happen and unfold in the way that you expect. So think about your timeline. There are some ways in which research networks are quite efficient, or they have efficiencies built in. There are other ways that they may not be so efficient. It's not as simple as developing your protocol, finalizing your plan, and getting approvals in place, and then off you are to execution in a single center. Rather, you need to have buy-in and support and refinement of your scientific questions and the quality of the work that you're doing through the network process. And then again, there's buy-in of all those individual sites, and that can take time, and following the relevant processes. Data and agreements. Understanding that loose collaboration versus very formal structure also becomes important in thinking about intellectual property, data sharing, what it means to be a member of a network. Is there actually a formal contractual agreement or a consortium agreement that you need to sign on to? And you need to understand, well, can I sign on to that? Does my institution need to sign on to that? Does it involve sites in the European Union? And you need to understand EU data protections. All of those things are really also quite critical. Again, where there might be efficiency, though, is that some of those things, whether it's a publication plan, data sharing plan, all of these agreements for some really well operating sites are already established at sort of a master contract level, and you can have power going to your institution by saying, these are the institutions that have already agreed to these terms, here's where we would fit into that. And then lastly, but certainly not least, is focus. I'll go back to myself as an example. As a child neurologist working in Parkinson's disease studies, I had very clear goals. I knew what I wanted to learn, and I knew that it was a really unique opportunity to, in a hands-on way, early in my career, have the chance to understand and really learn about the details of clinical trial operations. It wasn't something that I was going to do with this particular network forever, but helped me understand what it meant to work in a network. I also had the goal that I wanted to write, and I wanted to have ways to represent this participation, which wasn't necessarily for the most part, directly executing my own research ideas, but I needed to have ways that I could represent what I did and what I had got out of it on my CV, so that I could think about how I account for that time, that it wasn't just training, but that I also made some advancement as well. And so that's where some of the additional sub-projects came in, because those were things where I, with others, conceived of the idea and was able to execute that, answer those research questions, and then bring the publication to fruition. You want to be clear that you have a sense of where you're looking to go and how involvement in research networks best serves you. Is it about recruitment? Is it about resources? Is it about training? Is it about being able to efficiently advance the research that's needed to answer a question that you currently have and are focused on? So what is it that you want to obtain out of the experience or out of your contribution? And being really focused on that helps quite a bit, and also helps with some of this meandering timeline piece of things too. There are lots of clinical research networks. These are just a few. For those of you who are really interested in clinical care and care improvement, I point to the Leukodystrophy Care Network that takes more of a cystic fibrosis model to improvements in care, to NeuroNEXT, Clinical Trials Consortium, International Pediatric Stroke Organization, the Muscle Study Group. There are just a whole host of organizations, and the RDCRN really actually represents dozens of clinical research networks under a single umbrella. So this is just a sample of some of what might fit with some of your interests. I mentioned that some programs have training opportunities. The RDCRN is one such group, and information about their training program can be found on their website. And I mentioned that the Undiagnosed Diseases Network, or that some networks have funding, and the UDN is an example of a research network that has funding opportunities for members, but also for organizations outside of UDN grantees as well. And I think what I'd like to do now is to transition to our first network example, and that's PERC, the Pediatric Epilepsy Research Consortium. And I'm really pleased to have Zach Grinspan and Sucheta Joshi joining us today to talk a bit about PERC and to sort of make more concrete some of the things that we've been talking about and expand that a bit.
Thanks, Erika. Oh, I was going to say the same thing. I think Ariel has been trying to ask a question, so this is a perfect segue to get her to chime in before Zach and I take the mic for a little bit.
Fantastic. Please join in there, Ariel.
Thank you so much. I'm sorry, I didn't want to be rude and interrupt. A couple of slides back, you mentioned that it's important to make sure that the questions that you're asking align with the research network that you're looking to join. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how do you know? Is it like a journal where you go, they have like a mission statement and there's like a page on their website that will say, these are our goals? Or is there a certain person or position in the organization you'd look for, like a executive director who would be the appropriate person to reach out to? Like, how do you find out if this is the right organization to be trying to form that collaboration with?
I'll start with the generic example, and then maybe actually as the two of you talk about PERC, you can speak about that a bit from a PERC perspective. Sometimes that's very specifically outlined, just even starting with your usual kind of website, web-based research. What is this organization? What do they say that their goals are? And what is the ongoing work? You'll hear more about NeuroNEXT, but to use a NeuroNEXT example, that's a network focused on clinical trials and biomarker development, and specifically early phase or phase 2 clinical trials. And so if you are looking to deploy a large scale phase 3 or even phase 4 kind of study, that's not going to be a great fit for NeuroNEXT, because they're very clear in what they're there to do and the kind of work that they're interested in. Some groups will have right on their websites or information available, well, what are the processes for submitting an idea? And if they have those formal channels, then go ahead and submit those ideas so that you can get that feedback. And then if not, I think generally speaking, people are collaborative. They are working in a research network because they want to be collaborative. So find out who is there either within their training committee or their new projects committee or even their steering committee, and reach out to those folks to say, I have an idea and I want to understand if this is right for your network. Could we talk about that? Could I send you some ideas, or could we set up a call? And most people are pretty receptive to that, especially if you're coming with a specific rather than a generic question. Okay, I'm going to turn things over to Sucheta and Zach.
So thanks, Erika, for this invitation and for including PERC in today's webinar. Zach and I are going to share the next 10 minutes taking you through how PERC came about. I think it is a relevant story to the one you have already told us. In fact, it's the perfect segue to talk about PERC. And then Zach will also has some other stuff to share about the kind of networking work that PERC does. So if I can have the next slide. So PERC is the Pediatric Epilepsy Research Consortium, And our mission is to provide a network and infrastructure to facilitate collegial, collaborative, practice-changing research that will provide answers needed to improve the care of children with epilepsy. It's a long mouthful of a sentence, but I think it's important to just think of the mission of PERC and how PERC came about in the context of research networks. So close to 10 years ago, PERC was formed in a little hallway at the American Epilepsy Society meeting. And really the driver behind looking at an epilepsy research consortium or an epilepsy research network was the sense that we all take care of children with rare epilepsies. There is not a lot of well-done research on any one particular pediatric epilepsy, particularly the rare ones. And it's really difficult to do that research when you are at a single center where you see a handful, sometimes single-digit numbers of children with particular types of epilepsy. The Children's Oncology Group has been sort of the leader in looking at collaborative research, and such that pretty much any child with a new diagnosis of a childhood cancer is now part of a network, part of a protocol for their treatment. And that was one of the driving forces, one of the inspiration, if you will, about looking at epilepsy also as a disease or a group of diseases that could benefit from a network of epilepsy centers where everybody is asking the same question, looking for the same answers, but does not really have the power to study a particular epilepsy just in their limited space. So that was really sort of the impetus to get PERC going. And 10 years later, PERC has become a fairly robust network of pediatric epilepsy programs. If I can have the next slide, please. To date, there are over 54 epilepsy centers from across the country, coast to coast. This is our website. It's Pediatric ERC. It looks a little funny when you look at it, .com. This map does not fully reflect some of the newer members who have joined PERC, but it has a very rich and robust representation from across the United States. Next slide. This is just to give you a sense of how PERC works. I'll talk you through this in just a little bit. Basically, at the middle of the backbone of PERC is the steering committee. I sit on the steering committee. Zach Grinspan is the chair. And these members are added to the steering committee on an annual basis. There is a fixed amount of time that we spend on the steering committee and make our way up through being a member and eventually the chair and then the past chair. So you can see how that works. There are several other committees that do some of the core essential work for PERC. And then what's great about PERC is the special interest group. So if I can have the next slide, that'll just sort of walk us through how this whole process works. Oh, yeah, you can stop right there. So as I said, what really makes PERC so unique and special is the special interest groups. And as you can see, these speak to various aspects within pediatric epilepsy. I'll just name a few: Lennox-Gastaut syndrome, the behavioral health group, the epilepsy surgery group, and they're not necessarily limited to just the core clinical questions, but even things that are like value utilization. In today's day and age, telemedicine has come to the forefront of everybody's clinical practice. And when these groups meet, they develop projects, they brainstorm, they come up with ideas. And as these ideas take a more formed shape, they're not just a lump of clay on the potter's wheel, but they actually start taking shape. Then Erika, if you can just hit the, yes, thank you. Then they kind of morph or evolve into what become affiliated projects. Some of these are funded, some of these are not funded, some of these are on their way to being funded, but this becomes some very robust work that PERC has done, is doing, and will continue to do. So with that being said, we can go to the next slide. The way we our operational the way we work is there are some in-person meetings. I don't know what those are going to look like in the year 2020, which would have been our 10-year anniversary. But we typically meet at the American Epilepsy Society. We have had a spring retreat, if you will, at Colorado, at Fort Worth, and our one at New York City, which should have been last week, happened virtually over a couple of hours. There are every other month phone calls where all the special interest group leaders meet. We discuss with the entire PERC network what's going on. There is information on the website. The special interest groups kind of chart their own path and are fairly autonomous and decide what works for them and when they meet. And that's kind of how everybody works independently, but then comes together. So with that being said, I think I'm going to turn it over to Zach to talk about a little more specifics about the research that PERC has fostered.
Sure. Thank you so much, Sucheta. So I think one of the implicit premises of how PERC has had its success is that we've sort of recognized that research is really a social activity, particularly clinical research. And so the way the organization is structured is that there are lots of opportunities for leadership. If you have an idea and you want to have your own special interest group and see if anyone else is interested, the burden of that is very light. Our infrastructure is quite light. We have an administrator that we pay a small fee to, and she helps sort of organize meetings and things like that, but it's not much more infrastructure than that. There's a real focus on junior faculty and making sure that junior faculty have a chance to lead. And it's really a kind of a vote with your feet organization. If you show up and you contribute, then often then there's opportunities for leadership, and it helps to get projects up and running. Next slide, please. Let me just run through some of the successful projects that have come from PERC. First is the Early Life Epilepsy Study that's led by Ann Berg. It's a database of 700 or 800 children with epilepsy in the first 3 years of life, that starts in the first 3 years of life. And that's led to a variety of epidemiologic papers and comparative effectiveness work. Next slide. The National Infantile Spasms Consortium, I think our database now has 500 or 600 kids. And that's led to a variety of again, some epidemiology papers, some comparative effectiveness, and some just clinical papers. For example, hips arrhythmia, we need to not be so obsessed with that anymore, that if a kid's got spasms, they have spasms, you need to treat them. Next slide. The Pediatric Epilepsy Learning Healthcare System is an effort that I lead. What we do is we take electronic health record data from our sites, crunch it, and then do work with that. It helps with patient recruitment, and we're able to do some direct research on that data. There's 20 centers involved in that effort, and we have data from 13. Next slide. And then Scott Perry is leading a pediatric surgical epilepsy database. They have 500 kids in that database from 20 centers, and are just getting some of their publications up and running. Next slide. The nice thing about having a consortium is when there's opportunities for small projects or for position statements or concept papers, you sort of have a group of people you can work with. So here are just some examples of that. The DOSA syndrome special interest group just decided to do a paper on how we treat that disease, and they wrote that up. There was some interest in how to do studies on focal onset seizures in infants and young children. And so PERC collaborated with an international group to develop a new study design for that. And then we're a ripe cohort for surveying. And so there was a survey about how we as a group do clinical care of children with seizures. Next slide. And then one more slide, click once more. For policy, we worked with the Child Neurology Society to make crisis standards of care for children with infantile spasms. We got that published up on their website, and there's manuscripts in the works. Next slide, please. Let me skip the next two and just go to the next slide. After this, I can skip this because we're running short on time. I wanted just to highlight this document that many of us have read, and Ann Berg directed me to this. It's a document that the National Cancer Institute put together on how to do collaborative team science. Clinical research for rare diseases, which is what a lot of us do in child neurology, really requires working with folks around the country. We all are passionate about this together, but we are all quirky because we're child neurologists, and so it sort of comes with the turf. So how do we work together, and how do we kind of manage our quirkiness towards a common goal? This document lays it out really nice, that things like trust, shared vision, emotional intelligence, leadership, mentoring, and on are the core competencies that you need to develop, often very explicitly and intentionally, in order to work well in these large groups. I owe a lot of my, if I've had any success, I owe so much of it to PERC. As Sucheta said, these are hallway conversations. This talk is too dry. I'm going to step out and, oh, how are you doing? Haven't talked to you in a while. Let's have a cup of coffee. Those conversations is how our ideas come together. And you have enough of those, and you sort of develop these networks, making sure that you're attentive to these skills and attentive to those relationships is really how the successful research comes together. And so for those on the call, you're going to learn the research skills in these next years of your K-12, but it's your social skills that are going to make you a successful network collaborator and network leader. We're depending on you for our field and for our future, to understand what we're supposed to do with these kids with some of these terrible diseases. So I look forward to all of your success. And Erika, thanks for inviting us to talk.
Thanks for joining us. And I think I'll transition right to Laurie, and then we'll open up for more questions at the end. And she'll present quite a different kind of network. And I think they, again, really contrast with each other. One that's really much more about team science and developing new ideas, and another kind of network that's actually much more about execution and efficiency. So with that, I'll turn things over to Laurie.
Well, so I look much better in that picture than I do right now. Being on the hospital service and wearing a face shield all day does wonders for your looks in general. And of course, I look great in green. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the NeuroNEXT clinical trial networks. And I'm just going to run through relatively quickly what is NeuroNEXT. It is another network. I think that, if you're not getting any message from this, it is that there are lots of different networks out there and lots of ways that you can work with them, and that you can work with multiple networks. You don't have to just resort to working with only one. So NeuroNEXT is the NIH Network for Excellence in Neuroscience Clinical Trials. There is a website that you can go to. It was funded initially in 2011 with a clinical coordinating center that is based at Mass General, a data coordinating center that is based at the University of Iowa, and then 25 clinical study sites. The network was renewed in 2018, and 17 of the original sites were retained, and there were 8 new sites that were that joined. Its vision is to really look at neurologic diseases, and especially rare neurologic disorders, by partnering with academia, private foundations, industry, and to try to expand NINDS's ability to be efficient in testing promising new therapies and to respond quickly as new opportunities arise. And the next slide is good. These were the original funded sites in 2011, and then the next one will show you where the sites are now. The point of, so all of these sites have a master clinical trials agreement, and they also use a central IRB. So that means any study that comes into the network is already set up to go as soon as you get all your SOPs and your, your consent forms, et cetera, et cetera. It's all ready to go. Next slide. I think so. Yeah. So the grant that each clinical site gets, so each of the 25 sites has a grant that was awarded. It's competitive, as I mentioned, and it funds personnel. So it's an infrastructure grant, really. So these grants fund the body of the network. There's a PI or 2 PIs. So our site, University of Iowa, I share with Kathy Matthews, who's a child neurologist, and we work together on that. So we're co-PIs. And then there's a part of a fellow and 100% of a coordinator. So the funds for the NeuroNEXT fellow I'm going to talk about in a minute, because I think that's probably the most important for this group to try to understand. But the grants also fund travel to annual meetings, and there's other activities that might be site specific that you can use the grants for. But they're really infrastructure grants, so they're not to do research with. And this is the network infrastructure, so it's NINDS, the 3 leaders at NINDS, Janice Cordell, Robin Conwit, Kodrin Lungu, and then the Clinical Coordinating Center, Merritt, and Sokovich, and the Data Coordinating Center, Krista Coffey. So you can go through these a little. I'm sorry, I didn't know there was animation on these slides. Apologize. So this is the proposals, how the process works. So if you, as an investigator, wanted to use the network, you would go to NINDS. So you would go to Kodrin and email them and say, I have this proposal. There's a form that you can get that's on the website that is just a short proposal form that you can put together. They will tell you if NINDS is interested in it, and then it goes to the executive committee. They look at it, they send it out to the sites. Is it something that's feasible to do? And then they work with you on the protocol design. So one of the other advantages of this network, besides the fellowship, which we'll talk about in a minute, is that you can come with an idea and they will help you build the protocol before you submit it. And they will help you with the grant preparation, and then you submit. Then you still have to submit to study section. If it gets funded, then it plugs into the network and it rolls. So the longest part of all of this is sort of preparing this, but there's a relatively good success rate, and I didn't put all the numbers in here, but so far there have been 10 funded studies up to this point, and there's quite a few in the hopper still. So these are the studies that have been funded, and as you can see, there's at least 2 that are pertinent to child neurologists. The spinal muscular atrophy study was our very first one, and it was a biomarker study, and they are interested in phase 1, 2, or biomarker studies, and that's what all of these are. But you can see it's a whole array of these, so it's not just specific for a certain disease, which is also kind of the fun thing about being a part of NeuroNEXT, is that you get to learn about all sorts of different diseases and different ways of designing clinical trials. So these are why you might want to. So I alluded to some of this already. There's the central IRB, there's the master clinical trial agreements, all of which make things move a little bit faster. Once you get funded, the period to getting funded can sometimes be about the same amount of time, but once the study is funded, the time is cut significantly between funding and first recruitment. And I have to say that every study that has gone through NeuroNEXT has recruited fully and on time or ahead of time, which is like unheard of for rare disease clinical trials. So if you wanted to submit a proposal, this is what you would do. I can answer more questions about it specifically, but I don't want us to run out of time. So let's talk about the NeuroNEXT fellowships. So the fellowship, so every site has funding to support part of the salary of a fellow, but the fellow isn't a fellow, like it's almost all the fellows are junior faculty. junior faculty who, like Erika talked about her experience, my experience was the same. You know, I finished, I was interested in clinical research, but I'd never done any clinical research before. And that's what the fellows that's what the fellows are really for. Someone who has not had any significant time doing clinical trials, but is interested in a career in clinical research. You're the perfect person for the fellowship. You have to be at a NeuroNEXT site, but if you are at a NeuroNEXT site, you should look into it. Now, some NeuroNEXT sites are, the PI is an adult neurologist, and so they may not advertise as widely to the pediatric neurologist, depending on if you're in the Department of Neurology or you're in the Department of Pediatrics. You know, at our site, we have, in the years that we've had NeuroNEXT fellows, we have had our first fellow was a child neurologist, our second fellow was not, and our third fellow won't be either, but our fourth fellow we're already planning on is going to be a child neurologist. So so it's really, and part of the NeuroNEXT fellowship is not just funding some of your time, but there's a whole education program that has to occur. Erika mentioned I'm co-chair of the NeuroNEXT Education Committee, and that committee sets up webinars and different educational opportunities. One of the key things that happens is at the NeuroNEXT annual meeting, which used to be in person. I don't know if we're ever going to be in person again. I'm hoping someday we'll all be in person again, but at that meeting, there is networking for all the NeuroNEXT fellows. So they come together. There's some educational component, but the key thing is sitting around tables and just talking with other researchers, with mentors from other institutions about your ideas, about where to go. And like Sucheta and Zach said, I mean, that's where really the most interesting projects come from. Just sitting around and talking to people, right? You just, that's yeah, I'm getting 2 thumbs up, right? I mean, that's when it really happens. You sit down and you're talking at a table or even at the break of the annual meeting, and that's what makes the difference. I
think that's
part of this fellowship too. I'm sorry?
I was going to say, I think that's a perfect place for us to open up to questions on how people engage. And I'm going to change the screen to your last slide on additional webinars while we open things up for questions. Brenda, I'm going to have you take over on either chat or any hand raising to get to questions, but we'd love to hear some questions.
So the clinical trials methodology course is now part of NeuroNEXT, and it's something that's open to anybody who is interested in clinical research and hasn't designed clinical trials. And this year it's not in person, but you get the opportunity. So you get an opportunity to attend any of these webinars. So stop talking.
Are there questions for any of our speakers about clinical research networks, engagement, bringing new projects? While we're awaiting questions, I'll ask one. So for Zach and Sucheta, if someone has a new idea, what's their next step? What would they do?
I can answer that. There's a couple of different things that people can do. You can propose a special interest group. And just at our last meeting, we had 2 new ones, one on sunflower syndrome and one on telemedicine. And those, you know, we're not so formal. So I think one of them our steering committee explicitly approved, and the other one we just sort of said, okay, let's just put it forward. And then you can advertise those groups at our in-person meetings or through the every other month phone calls to get other collaborators. And then our administrator will help coordinate those calls. But then the other way is, in the special interest groups is you just join the calls and you're like, hey, wouldn't it be cool if we looked at X, Y, Z, and those groups are meant for those discussions.
I'm kind of curious about the NeuroNEXT. So if you're not at a NeuroNEXT site, but you have an idea, is that feasible?
Yep. Yeah. Actually, if you, when I go through, probably at least 50% of the studies that have been done have been proposed by people who were not at NeuroNEXT sites. So NeuroNEXT is, and if it's your project, then your site gets added as another site, obviously. And they don't use all 25 sites for every study. So like some studies, you know, because of the specialty, maybe special equipment or the population itself, and they might only use 6 sites or they might use 10 sites. But if you propose it, your site obviously is going to be one of the sites where the study is done. But you don't have to be a NeuroNEXT site to apply. And actually, it doesn't weigh one way or another in your acceptance.
Hi, this is Yula. I have a question. So I'm in the early stages of kind of helping form this kind of consortium in neuro-onco-immunology. So it's kind of cross-disciplinary. But I'm curious about people who have participated in forming networks. How do you decide the leadership structure? You know, how did this come together? It seems like there's no clear roadmap, but somehow it keeps happening.
I can talk about PERC, and I'll speak informally if that's okay. When PERC started, there was a feeling that in pediatric epilepsy, a lot of the work was being led by, quote, the usual suspects. There was sort of a core group of people that were doing a lot of everything. And so there was a leadership structure that had fairly rapid turnover. So you were only supposed to be on the steering committee for 3 years. They kind of had a group of 5 people and they were supposed to rotate off through this specific structure. That was determined sort of voting by people's feet, that like the people who were doing a lot to get PERC organized ended up being in that steering committee. Then we had a voting process to vote people on. We ignored our charter and people were on for 4 years instead of 3. And so finally last year, I mean, because we've been around for 8 or 9 years, had been around for 8 or 9 years, we became a little bit more formal about it. We realized that 3 years was not long enough because you sort of lost institutional memory. And so we put the chair as the person in the 4th year. So I'm wearing that hat at present. And then the chair stays around. So when you're on the steering committee, it's a 5-year term. You lead the board as your 4th, and then you stick around. And we rotate 1 new person on each year, and there's an election for that. But there are more than one ways to do it, and there are people who sort of think about this. Often they're lawyers. So we've been incorporating ourselves. We've been renewing kind of our founding documents and going on this path to become an independent 501c3, and have 2 lawyers, one who's just a personal friend, helping us think through how to do that structure. The short way to sum that up is that PERC grew quite organically. Other organizations have been much more thoughtful about organizational structure from the onset. And so I think, you know, there are multiple paths to success, I think, is the other lesson.
Thank you, that's fascinating.
And the degree of infrastructure and these other things also may depend on, you know, what the anticipated longevity of the arrangement is, how large the collaboration is, and there are a number of other factors. Some simple things around data and publications and making sure you have agreement among the investigators on those initial basics, then things may grow or not from there. Sounds like there's another question.
It's Brenda again, though, but I have a question. There are certain child neurology disorders that are relatively rare, I would say, that have a much more, I would say, successful in that they get a lot of grants, that they work with industry to kind of modify protocols and get studies done, and that all comes from money. I mean, the grants and the companies are what provides the money, which is sort of what I think sometimes lacking in some of the things that I've been involved with. And I'm just curious as to whether we need more of that. Do people think in child neurology?
in terms of
I'm thinking about,
sponsored collaboration, or sorry?
yeah, well, I'm thinking about pediatric rheumatology and CF and muscular dystrophy. Some of those organizations, for whatever reasons, like I think that you can't get a pediatric rheumatology study done very easily in this country without going through kind of a governing body and of pediatric rheumatologists. Like they've just kind of banded together and said, okay, if you want to do something, you got to go through us. And that provides them with a lot of infrastructure and I think more funding. I just was kind of curious, since you guys are very involved in these kind of organizations, if you've thought about that.
I'll answer briefly, and we're just a little bit over time, so I might be quite brief. But I think that for those organizations, it's also their origins are important to remember too. And they started small, and CF in particular, they started as a group of investigators working with the patient community to answer clinical questions, actually much like the Leukodystrophy Care Network, really focused on clinical care. While we're awaiting or when we're looking to develop new therapies, that's great. What do we have now and how do we best use what we have now? So there was a very focused initial set of research questions, and then that grew over time, and then knowledge grew over time as well. And so, I don't know that I necessarily would say that there have to be, greater numbers of networks with strong industry support. Rather, in the other direction, it's really important that both patients and caregivers and other stakeholders and investigators have a voice in the development of trials so that they can be meaningful, effective, and can recruit well. So I think that sometimes networks are a part of that. There's power in the collective voice towards getting those things to occur. But the scientific questions and the knowledge base about the diseases and the needs are kind of where all of that starts, and then it grows from there. I think we're happy to continue to take questions and field things. I know that we're just a little bit over time, so I think we'll generally bring things to a close. Thank you all for joining. I've put up our website, the email for learning more about the future webinars, including the one that's next week, same day, same time. And we hope to see you at that one as well. And I will stay on for the chat and video a little bit longer if there are other questions. Thanks, everyone, and thanks to our speakers.
Thank you, everybody.
And we will share the slides. They'll be available on the CNCDP website, along with the recording. Thank you, Jennifer.
And as usual, I managed to not record the very first part. I'm so sorry. I just cannot seem to hit the record button at the right time. So sorry, everyone.
I'm glad you remembered. All right. Thank you, everyone. Have a good afternoon. Thank you.
Bye.
Laurie, thank you. Bye.